Hello everyone. In this video, we'll be working on reconstructing mid-sized arguments. These are not super long arguments, but they're also not the very short arguments we studied in the last video. So like the last one, I'll ask you to grab a piece of paper and pen to follow along. You'll need to hit pause every once in a while to, just give it a try out some ideas, and then get some feedback on your ideas pretty promptly. So here's the first argument. Acupuncture is a fraudulent medical practice. There are several reasons for believing this. First of all, controlled scientific experiments show no difference in pain relief experienced by people who underwent genuine acupuncture treatments and a placebo group, people who merely thought they were receiving acupuncture treatments but who actually didn't. This shows that acupuncture doesn't work. Secondly, there are several signs that acupuncturists are a community of quacks. Studies show that different acupuncturists tend to give the same patient who presents the same symptoms very different diagnoses. And even when they agree on a diagnosis, acupuncturists prescribe wildly different remedies. Moreover, acupuncturists systematically overestimate the relief patients will experience as a result of their care. Finally, acupuncturists are extremely hostile to any criticisms of their methods and practices, so acupuncture is rife with quackery. Our task here, of course, is to reconstruct this argument in standard form as charitably as we possibly can. And a really good place to start in any argument reconstruction is just to start to look for the conclusion first, and then maybe use some premise and conclusion indicator words to help you find that conclusion. The rest can be built around the conclusion. So if we take a look here, we have a sentence that indicates that some reasons are forthcoming. There are several reasons for believing this. That introduces usually a string of premises. But what's right before it? The statement, acupuncture is a fraudulent medical practice. And that is actually the conclusion of the entire argument. So there is going to be one main argument here, and its main conclusion is going to be that first sentence. Everything that follows that is some kind of supporting argument. If you looked closely, you may have noticed a couple of other conclusion indicators. For instance, about a third of the way down, this shows that is usually a conclusion indicator, and it is in this case, but I don't think it's the main conclusion. And then down at the very bottom, so acupuncture is rife with quackery. That's also a conclusion indicator word, so. But in this case, it's not the main conclusion. So we're going to have to figure out what's going on with those two conclusion indicators. So let's take a look at the argument, a main argument reconstruction. As I've said, the conclusion of the argument is the claim that acupuncture is a fraudulent practice. That's the first statement. The next sentence says there are several reasons for believing this, and I just want to attract your attention to that first of all, and then that secondly that I now have highlighted. First of all, acupuncture doesn't work. Secondly, acupuncture is rife with quackery. Those are actually going to be the first and second premises of this standard form argument reconstruction. Premise 1, acupuncture doesn't work. Premise 2, acupuncture is rife with quackery. If we pause there just for a moment and just look at the main argument we have reconstructed so far. Premise 1, acupuncture doesn't work. Premise 2, acupuncture is rife with quackery. Therefore, down at the bottom, acupuncture is a fraudulent practice. There is a missing premise, a missing generalization, and it's fairly straightforward to fill that in. It must be some kind of generalization like what I have here, premise 3. If a therapeutic practice doesn't work and its practitioners show signs of quackery, then the practice is fraudulent. Something like that is being assumed here. There's a connection between not working and all of those different signs of quackery discussed in this passage and being fraud. If we look at everything that is not highlighted after the first sentence, all of the other text in white, what we're going to see is that those are sub-arguments. That's all sub-argumentation. So in other words, the person presenting this argument, which by the way was a student from a couple of years ago writing a paper for another class, the person presenting this argument provides us with evidence for the first premise. Acupuncture doesn't work. That's not just an assertion. That assertion is backed up by some evidence. And I want to highlight it. So here it is. Controlled scientific experiments show no difference in pain relief experienced by people who underwent genuine acupuncture and the placebo group. That shows that acupuncture doesn't work. Now, how should we deal with that? How should we work that bit of argumentation into our standard form argument reconstruction? The way to do it is by presenting a sub-argument for premise one. So again, premise one is the claim that acupuncture doesn't work. And if we look at the text, we see the claim, I'm calling it P1A, controlled scientific experiments show no difference in pain relief experienced by people who underwent genuine acupuncture treatments and a placebo group. Again, there's a step that's being taken here, and by that I mean there's an unstated generalization, and I think this is a generalization that does the job. If controlled experiments show no difference in pain relief between the experimental group, the acupuncture group, and a control group, in this case the placebo group, then that treatment doesn't work, in this case acupuncture. Okay, so we have a sub-argument presented in support of premise one. Do you remember what it's called when someone who presents an argument for a conclusion presents evidence in support of some of their other premises? This is this kind of argumentation involving sub-arguments is called extended argumentation, and we saw two different forms of extended argumentation, parallel and linear. Do you know which one this is? I'll talk to you about that in a moment. Let's take a look. Here we are back at the main argument again. Let's take a look at the second half of this passage. There are several signs that acupuncturists are a community of quacks, and the author presents several of them with the conclusion that acupuncture is rife with quackery. All of that is an argument in favor of premise two. So let's try to reconstruct that argument. So a sub-argument for premise two. Conclusion is acupuncture is rife with quackery. The first statement really is actually the second statement in yellow, and that is the premise that different acupuncturists will give the same patient who presents the same symptoms very different diagnoses. And then we just move through the list. When acupuncturists agree on a diagnosis, they prescribe wildly different remedies. Acupuncturists systematically overestimate the relief that patients will experience as a result of their care. And acupuncturists are extremely hostile to any criticisms of their methods and practices. Those are the stated premises, and the conclusion is that acupuncture is rife with quackery. So interestingly, we see this term quackery in the conclusion, but we don't see it among the premises. So that's a sign that there has been some kind of an unstated assumptions, and we need to make that explicit. Something like the following should do the trick. The lack of uniformity of diagnoses and treatments, the exaggeration of expected results, and the hostility to criticisms displayed by acupuncturists are all marks of quackery. And that completes the argument that is presented in support of premise two. So what we have then is one main argument in favor of the conclusion that acupuncture is a fraudulent practice, but the author presents sub-arguments one subargument in favor of premise 1 and a different subargument in favor of premise 2. And we saw what those looked like. We reconstructed those as standard form arguments, and we even stated the unstated generalizations in those arguments. When you have that kind of extended argument structure, where one argument supports the premise of a different argument, it's called linear extended argumentation. So this passage contains a linear extended argument in favor of the claim that acupuncture is a fraudulent medical practice. Okay? Let's look at a second passage. A chimera is an individual composed of cells with different embryonic origins. The successful isolation of 5 human embryonic stem cell lines in 1998 increased scientists' ability to create human, non-human chimeras. These chimeras can be created to grow human organs in or on non-human animals for transplant into human recipients. But the creation of chimeras violates the natural species boundaries between humans and non-human animals. It is therefore wrong. Violating natural species boundaries is wrong on many levels. To begin, there's a serious possibility of a public health crisis arising from a transmissible infection crossing species boundaries. Furthermore, there are adverse consequences for the animal to consider. Finally, and most importantly, the creation of chimeras disrespects a sacred distinction between humanity and the rest of creation. So we want to analyze this argument. We want to reconstruct it in standard form. And it too is an extended argument. And so we will be examining sub-arguments along the way. But let's get at the main argument. Where is it? What is its main conclusion? I just want to point out that the first few sentences in this passage, and I've sort of made them appear a little more dull, are just some background information, factual information about what chimeras are, where they came from, and why they're being grown. And that information does not contain any particular argumentation. We do see argumentation pick up shortly thereafter, however. The creation of chimeras violates the natural species boundaries between humans and non-human animals. It is therefore wrong. This argument is a nice little one-step argument, it looks like, and it resembles very much the very short argument reconstructions we worked on in the last video. But let's go ahead and lay it out in standard form, just at least this much of it. So the conclusion is that the creation of chimeras is wrong, and we see the word therefore here in this passage. It is therefore wrong. What is it? The creation of chimeras. So the premise then would be, premise 1, the creation of chimeras violates the natural species boundaries between humans and non-human animals. If we look at this premise and this conclusion, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that the conclusion says that the creation of chimeras is wrong. It says that something is wrong. The premise doesn't mention the word wrong. So that's going to be a key term that has to figure in any unstated premise. Okay, so what's being assumed here? The creation of chimeras violates natural species boundaries, and it's therefore wrong. You can hit pause on this video and try to come up with a missing premise there. It is probably something like this. Violating natural species boundaries between humans and non-human animals is wrong. Okay? And now we have that sort of flow of that categorical syllogism that you're familiar with. Creation of chimeras violates natural species boundaries. Violating natural species boundaries is wrong. The creation of chimeras is wrong. And indeed, we actually see that second premise stated next. Violating natural species boundaries is wrong on many levels. So let's take a look at that. Wrong on many levels. To begin, There's a serious possibility of a public health crisis arising from a transmissible infection crossing species boundaries. Furthermore, there are adverse consequences for the animal to consider. Finally, and most importantly, the creation of chimeras disrespects the sacred distinction between humanity and the rest of creation. Take a look at some of those phrases. To begin, furthermore, finally, and most importantly. This person is listing off multiple reasons for thinking that violating natural species boundaries is wrong. So all of that is part of some kind of sub-argumentation in favor of premise 2. And I think that those are actually 3 different kinds of arguments against violating natural species boundaries. So let's take a look at one way of reconstructing all of that argumentation. So I think there's actually 3 separate arguments, and this would be the first one. Again, the conclusion of all 3 of these arguments will be premise 2. Violating natural species boundaries between humans and non-human animals is wrong. But why? Well, first, P2A, violating natural species boundaries increases the risk of a public health crisis arising from a transmissible infection crossing species boundaries. And what's unstated there is it's wrong to at least unnecessarily increase the risk of a public health crisis. And that's why it's wrong to violate natural species boundaries. We get a very different argument after the word furthermore. There are adverse consequences for the animal to consider. So that gives us a second argument in favor of, once again, P2, violating natural species boundaries between humans and non-human animals is wrong. So let's list that as P2C. Violating natural species boundaries causes harm to non-human animals. We're to think of these lab animals that are growing organs inside of their bodies or on the backs of their bodies that live inhumane lives and who often die as a consequence of having those organs harvested. Violating natural species boundaries in this way causes harm to the non-human animals involved. And the tacit assumption here, which we need to make explicit, is, well, it's wrong to unnecessarily cause harm to non-human animals. And that gets us to the conclusion that violating natural species boundaries between humans and non-human animals is wrong. There is then the finally and most importantly bit to consider, and I take that to be a third sub-argument for premise 2. Again, the conclusion is premise 2. What's the first premise in support of it? P2E. Violating natural species boundaries disrespects the sacred distinction between humanity and the rest of creation. This is sounds like a religious argument. So it's unlike the other 2 arguments. And of course, implicitly here, but now explicitly stated, it's wrong to at least unnecessarily disrespect the sacred distinction between humanity and the rest of creation. And that establishes premise 2. In this case, we have an argument against the creation of chimeras, and the argument rests on the generalization that violating natural species boundaries is wrong, between human and non-human animals is wrong. And the person presenting this argument gives us 3 separate, independent arguments that support premise 2. Do you remember what that kind of extended argument structure is called? Well, this one would be an example of a mixed parallel and linear structure. Because the person presenting this argument gives an argument in favor of premise 2, it's automatically a linear argument. Anytime someone argues in favor of the premises in another argument, it's linear. However, the argument in favor of premise 2 is actually a parallel argument. There were 3 separate sub-arguments that all arrived at the same conclusion. In this case, our premise 2 displayed there on the screen. So in these 2 arguments, the one first about acupuncture, and now this one about chimera research, we saw extended argumentation in both cases. That's just arguments with sub-arguments. And in the first one, against acupuncture, about acupuncture, it gave two arguments in favor of two of the main premises in the main argument. What we see in the chimera argument here, it's also extended, but the author only argues in favor of the second premise, so it's still linear, but offers multiple independent lines of argumentation in favor of the second premise. And that aspect of it is parallel extended argumentation. So this one has a mixture of linear and parallel argumentation.